There are nights when the light inside a small club feels warmer than the sun itself. A band settles into a slow groove, the crowd leans forward, and an old familiar voice rises the way smoke curls from a forgotten candle. It was the kind of voice that could soften grief or crack it wide open. No one in that room knew they were listening to a man running from a lifetime of broken places. No one knew how far he had climbed just to stand on that modest stage, wrapped in a glow far smaller than the arenas he once commanded. The silence between his notes carried more truth than applause ever could. And yet, those who heard him that night felt something stirring, a memory of love, of loss, of a world where soul music could heal what life had damaged. But how does a voice that once defined an era disappear into the shadows? How does a man who helped lift a legendary group into history find himself singing to strangers who never knew the weight he carried? This is the long, winding story of a gift, a wound, and a legacy that refused to fade. He came into the world on an early April morning in Cincinnati, a place where church bells carried farther than any promise, and where families held tight to music because it was often the only thing they had. His name was Philippe Walker then, long before the world would call him something else. In that house, faith wasn't just taught, it was breathed. Voices layered over one another in Sunday rehearsals, children learning harmony before they understood heartache. But heartache arrived early. His parents split when he was still young, leaving him and his siblings caught between two people who loved them but couldn't stay. When his mother left for Detroit with another man, the children were placed in the colored orphanage asylum. And for Philippe, the hardest truth was not the cold floors or the strict routines. It was knowing both parents were alive somewhere, just out of reach. 5 years passed like that, days blurring into nights. Then one morning he and his brother ran. 2 boys on foot, racing away from abandonment, chasing a piece of themselves they feared might disappear. His brother headed north toward Detroit, searching for the mother who had left. Philippe returned to Cincinnati, back to a father who worked more than he slept, a man doing his best with little guidance to offer. Philippe drifted through homes, staying with relatives, taking whatever work would keep him moving. Restlessness became a second skin. And then, at 15, he did something boys in hard places often do. He lied about his age and joined the military. They believed him. He put on the uniform and stepped into a world where structure replaced uncertainty. The military gave him bruises, discipline, and a GED. But it also returned him to music. In the quiet hours after drills, he boxed for release and sang for survival. His voice, raw and unguarded, caught the attention of musicians who recognized its gravity. That connection led him to Otis Redding's band for a time, a glimpse into a future he didn't yet have the courage to claim. 7 years later, discharged and older in ways life seldom teaches gently, he followed his brother to Detroit. Together they formed the Walker Singers, a gospel group carrying the fire of their childhood. But gospel didn't pay rent, and Detroit streets were restless with new rhythms. So he stepped away from sacred music, choosing instead the secular R&B scene, a choice that would reshape everything. He dropped his father's name and took his mother's, adding an extra letter as if rewriting his own story. And it was under this new name that he crossed paths with Bootsy and Catfish Collins, 2 brothers whose sound was as wild as their spirits. They brought him into the Pacemakers, a band on the edge of something big. This was where the world finally began to hear him. Detroit was a crossroads for him, a place where old wounds met new chances. Word traveled fast in that city, especially among musicians searching for the next voice that could lift a song into something unforgettable. When the Spinners began looking for a lead singer, it was family who spoke first. G.C. Cameron, already part of the group, told them his cousin had a tone unlike anything they had ever heard. Even Eddie Kendricks nodded in agreement, urging them not to let this voice slip away. But timing, as always, played its own hand. The Spinners were leaving Motown, stepping out from the long shadow of a label that had never given them its full attention. Aretha Franklin pointed them to Atlantic Records, where producer Tom Bell was shaping what would become the sound of entire cities. Bell had the patience of a craftsman and the intuition of someone who knew how to turn a voice into a story. When Philippe walked into the room, Bell recognized the electricity immediately. What happened next was a kind of quiet revolution. In 1973, the Spinners released their self-titled album, and suddenly the group that had waited years for recognition found themselves standing at the center of the soul music world. "I'll Be Around," sung with Bobby Smith on lead, floated across the country like a warm breeze. Then came "Could It Be I'm Falling in Love," where Felipe's voice braided itself into Bobby's with a softness that felt almost fragile. People didn't just hear those songs, they carried them. And then came the performance that changed everything. One-of-a-kind love affair gave Felipe room to stretch, to lean into the corners of a melody the way only he knew how. There was something in his phrasing, a bend, a hesitation, the faint sound of a man telling the truth even when the words were borrowed. Audiences recognized it instantly. It was the sound of someone who had lived every line. The momentum didn't stop. Their next album, Mighty Love, pushed their reach even further, sending them across the ocean to perform at the Rumble in the Jungle, where Muhammad Ali trained under the African sun. Footage still exists of Felipe and Ali playboxing, both men grinning like boys who had outrun their own fates. For a brief moment, the world felt small enough to hold them both. By the mid-70s, Felipe had become the unspoken pulse of the Spinners. His voice rose through Sadie, with the tenderness of a man singing to a memory he refused to let go. Audiences felt it. Some said the room changed when he performed that song, that people leaned closer, as if something sacred was happening. Then came the Rubber Band Man, a burst of joy that made radios dance across the country. For the first time, Philippe Wynne stood exactly where he had dreamed. Not in a uniform, not running from a childhood he couldn't rewrite, but at the front of a stage, carrying a group that had waited decades for the world to finally hear them. This was the height before the turn. Success can be a quiet companion, but so can doubt. As the Spinners climbed higher, voices outside the group began to circle around Philippe Wynne, whispering the same familiar temptation. You could be bigger on your own. It was the kind of message that finds a crack in even the strongest foundation. And for a man who had rebuilt himself more than once, the idea of standing alone felt like both a promise and a warning. In time, the whispers grew teeth. Felipe began to believe he should be the name on the marquee, not just the voice in the harmony. He asked the group to change their name to Felipe Wynne and the Spinners, a move that startled men who had spent years grinding their way toward equal recognition. They told him they loved him, but the answer was no. The group had survived too much to give up its own identity. So he walked away, not in anger, but with the wounded certainty of someone convinced destiny was calling elsewhere. The stage that once held him steady now felt like a place he needed to escape. Yet the truth was simpler. Leaving the Spinners meant stepping out of the safest chapter of his life. His first solo album, Starting All Over, carried hope in its title but nowhere else. It slipped quietly through the charts, barely noticed in a market that had once embraced him. He tried again, reconnecting with Bootsy Collins and George Clinton, diving into the wild world of P-Funk. For a moment, it looked like he had found another home, a place where eccentricity was welcome and boundaries didn't matter. His voice glided through, not just knee-deep, brushing up against a new generation of listeners. But momentum isn't the same as belonging. Record labels came and went. Contracts opened and closed. His 1980 release, Windjamming, flickered briefly and went dim. By the early 80s, he was an artist searching for a window that no longer opened as easily as it once had. Then came July 13, 1984. He was performing at Ivy's, a small club in Oakland, promoting what would become the final album of his life. The room was full but intimate, the kind of place where you could see the singer breathe. Felipe was vibrant that night, moving through the audience, shaking hands, letting people feel the warmth he carried even when the spotlight dimmed. During the encore, he stepped into Love Don't Love Nobody, a song that had once felt like a refuge. But as he walked through the crowd, the strength in his body shifted. Witnesses said he dropped the microphone as if letting go of a burden he had carried too long. Then he collapsed, surrounded by gasps, by helping hands, by the helplessness that settles when a life changes in an instant. An hour later, the hospital pronounced him gone. He was only 43. What followed was perhaps the quietest chapter of all. Only 8 people attended his funeral, a number so small it felt like an echo rather than a farewell. And as if grief needed layers, tragedy shadowed his family. One son was lost to violence in Compton. Another drowned while saving a stranger's life. The weight of it all pressed against the memory of a man whose voice had once lifted crowds to their feet. This was the fall no one saw coming, the silence after the applause. For many Americans, his voice lived in the background of their lives, drifting from car radios, spinning on turntables in living rooms where families gathered after long days. The Spinners were part of the country's fabric, even if history books didn't always say their name out loud. People knew the songs, felt the harmonies, tapped their fingers to the rhythms. Yet few ever paused long enough to ask about the man behind some of those unforgettable moments. In the broader landscape of American music, recognition can be uneven. Artists who shape entire eras sometimes slip through the cracks when the spotlight moves on. And for Black musicians, especially those who carried soul and R&B through the 70s, the divide between influence and acknowledgement often ran deep. The absence of the Spinners from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame puzzled many who understood how foundational their sound was. To some, it felt less like an oversight and more like a quiet dismissal of a legacy that mattered. Outside the United States, the story looked different. In the United Kingdom, their records were cherished, studied, replayed by generations who treasured the purity of the Philly soul sound. Across Europe, their tours filled halls where audiences listened with a reverence that suggested they were witnessing something rare. And in Africa, where Philippe Wynne once stood near Muhammad Ali during the Rumble in the Jungle festivities, the imagery of Black artistry rising on a global stage carried its own powerful symbolism. But back home, the narrative softened too quickly. American media moved on. Radio stations shifted formats. New stars arrived with new stories. The Spinners continued to perform, but their history was often treated as a footnote rather than a foundation. And Philippe, who had poured so much of himself into every stage he touched, became a memory known mostly to those who had lived through the era or loved the music enough to look back. Still, for older listeners, his voice remains a compass. It marks a time when soul music wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of surviving the world, a way of remembering who you were before life tested you. They hear him and are returned to moments they thought they had lost. It is here, in the quiet loyalty of American hearts and the steady admiration of audiences abroad, that his legacy found its second life. Recognition might have been uneven, but the impact never was. Legacy is a quiet thing. It doesn't always announce itself with awards or ceremonies or names etched into marble. Sometimes it lingers in the spaces people don't talk about, in the warmth of a familiar melody, in the memory of a voice that once made a crowded room feel gentle. That is where Philippe Wynne still lives. For all the turbulence he carried, his gift never faltered. His falsetto rose like a question, tender, searching, unmistakably his. It shaped the identity of the Spinners during the years when soul music found its place in American homes. His phrasing, his urgency, his willingness to lean into emotion without apology gave every song a pulse that listeners felt long before they understood it. Even now, when Sadie, the Rubber Band Man, or Could It Be I'm Falling in Love drifts through a speaker, his presence is immediate, intact, unbroken. The Spinners continue to tour, carrying the weight of decades behind them. Time has taken many of the original members, leaving Henry Fambrough as the last voice from the beginning. Yet the group moves forward, honoring the history that shaped them. Their harmonies remain a bridge across generations, proof that music, real music, doesn't fade. It settles into people, becoming part of the stories they hold closest. And Philippe's story, though marked by loss, offers something softer at its end. A reminder that brilliance doesn't always arrive wrapped in certainty. A reminder that the human heart is fragile even when the voice is strong. A reminder that some artists live their truest moments not in fame, but in the quiet grace of being remembered. Years after his passing, listeners still return to him. They return not because of headlines, but because his sound feels like an open window, a place where sorrow and comfort breathe the same air. The man who once ran from orphanages, from doubt, from the limits placed around him, left behind a body of work that continues to steady those who hear it. If his final stage was small, his echo was not. And if this story brings back a memory of a song, a moment, or someone you love,